I shared my story, from my testimony on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., I also was a former State of the Union guest of honor. But as I shared my story, from a federal perspective, I've had hundreds, if not thousands of people reach out to me from all across the United States, really sharing how my experiences have resonated with their experiences. So what we're really talking about is pretty universal treatment that we workers, whether we're talking about the state or elsewhere, we want fair treatment. We want to be psychologically safe in the workplace.
And what I've learned is that our laws are very out of date with what the science knows. We have extensive, peer-reviewed, replicated science over the course of the last 20 years that shows that all forms of bullying and abuse, they do not need to touch the body. All forms can do significant neurological scarring to the brain.
My decision to speak out came to pass because a journalism career I had built for more than 30 years after rising to the top of my profession, all of it was taken away from me, and it was not my choice.
The perpetrators were sitting in an administrative office building on a college campus cashing six-figure paychecks. It never crossed my mind the protocol was fraudulent, nor did I suspect they would conspire against me. While I was waiting for resolve, they were waiting for me to snap.
My research has defined a psychosocial hazard as a workplace factor perceived or experienced as a threat to the person exposed. In 2021, the International Organization for Standardization released ISO 45003, which is a global standard that provides guidelines for managing psychosocial risks in the workplace. The standard clearly identifies bullying as a psychosocial hazard. Section 5A1 of the OSH Act of 1970, or the General Duty Clause, requires employers to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm.
Bullying does not occur in a vacuum. It is supported by the structures or lack of structure and accountability in an organization. Abusive cultures do not just happen. They are created over time by the choices that the organization makes, who to promote, what policies are created and enforced, and how the company handles reports of abuse.
Like many others, I've endured a work environment filled with acts of deliberate intimidation, verbal abuse, and direct threats to my job and my ability to support my child. But unlike many others, I worked in HR, and I had a pretty good grasp of the rules. Yet in spite of that, I could not get anyone inside of my organization to help me. From board members to legal counsel, everyone knew there was a problem. Nobody wanted to act because it was a very powerful bully. In one particular instance, I asked for an independent outside investigation, and after much persistence, they opened one. At its conclusion, the investigator sustained allegations of abuse towards me, but also determined that no violation of EEO policy had occurred. In short, nothing unlawful had happened, and so no remedial action was required, and the abuse continued unabated.
Decades of research on human performance has shown that psychological safety is a requirement for innovative and high-performing teams. However, the sad reality is that only 20% of teams are considered high-performing, showing us the significant opportunity we have to increase psychological safety in organizations.
I support the Workplace Psychological Safety Act because it's the tool that human resources professionals need in order to take action against the bullies that are destroying the full potential of the companies and the employees who work for them, for the inside out. As a professional in human resources with over 20 years of progressive experience, I've seen it all. It's a known fact that bullies love to attack top performers, arguably one of a company's greatest resources.
In 2008, toxic workplaces cost organizations $16 billion in related healthcare costs, or almost $23 billion today. It's estimated that more than 120,000 deaths per year and approximately 5 to 8% of annual healthcare costs are associated with and may be attributable to how U.S. companies manage their workforce. The McKinsey Health Institute studied toxic work environments and found that they were the single largest predictor of negative employee outcomes such as burnout, depression, psychological distress, anxiety, and predicted more than 2 times the global variance of all positive practices combined. Specifically, they predicted 73% of turnover. Employees in these situations leave their jobs to prioritize their health without another source of income, which results in increased taxpayer expenses for things like TAMP, SNAP, and Medicare. These work-induced adverse childhood experiences, which are the single largest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today, are associated with chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance abuse later in life. For California alone, ACEs cost $112.5 billion a year.
We have an opportunity with this legislation to adopt policies that include the appropriate and reasonable guidelines to start taking action. For example, employment policies, and because I've seen this firsthand, that's the faculty civility advocate, employment policies need to have effective deterrence and response, immediate and smooth response to the work environments and abuse. They have to have clear and fair procedures, timely pathways, and accountability for the policy violators.
And I now sit on the board of directors for the Mass State Peer Support Network. In that role, one would think that the emergency calls would be at the forefront of the psychological safety of these workers. But what I found in a very short period of time, that it actually was the administrative betrayal of the workplaces that these workers worked in, which is why I am here to support H1882, the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. What happens is when the can gets kicked down the road enough, the extreme circumstances become the norm.
This issue is personal to me, as I nearly ended my life in March 2014 after leaving several leadership positions after being asked to do things that were unethical, abusive behavior, verbal and physical, and actions that violated my personal rights. If a physical attack occurred, then it would be immediately addressed and the initiator would be dealt with accordingly. However, if someone was mentally and emotionally abused someone, then these personal violations aren't always addressed or taken seriously. Instead, the focus of the psychological abuse is to instruct the target to toughen up or develop thick skin. These aren't useful comments, as it doesn't address underlying issues, which is that someone is being violated, actions aren't being taken to address a bona fide concern, and it's a dismissal of someone's communicated concerns that their rights are being violated.
As an employment lawyer, I've spoken to countless people who have experienced systematic abuse, but did not fall into a protected category. Being unable to help them for accountability for the harm they experienced weighed heavily on me, as I continued to refuse them as clients because the law did not protect them. The Surgeon General's report specifically calls for the protection against psychological harm. I often see concerns regarding costs associated with enacting legislation, especially the potential for case backlogs in an already burdened judicial system. But I ask, what is the cost that we are already paying? Has anyone looked into the cost on our society of the mental illness that is being cultivated and how that affects our future generations? The truth is that by enacting laws to provide accountability for psychological harm, we will witness more preventative measures by employers to stop such treatment for those circumstances that do not get adequately addressed. There must be accountability that creates deterrence. Today,
consistent with sexual harassment law, intent and harm to a person's health should not be required in order to prevail with their actionable legal claims in a court of law or at another tribunal, such as the MCAD, where I regularly represent women, often single mothers. Too many women put up with and are forced to tolerate bullying in the workplace because, as my brother counsel said, there is no adequate remedy if it doesn't fall within the purview of 151B under the MCAD, and if the client doesn't want to sit through a 2 to 3 year haul through Superior Court, they're left without a remedy. And why do they tolerate it? I'll give you a few reasons. Because the rent is past due, because the electricity shut off, because the oil tank is empty, because the car payment is late, because there are young mouths to feed at home, or because there are aging parents to care for.
Over the past decade, we have witnessed 18 workplace mass shootings. A third were subjected to relentless humiliation, harassment, and unmanageable workloads. The factors the shooters claim played a role in pushing them to the brink. The statistics are sobering. Victims of this tragic event faced a staggering 49% fatality rate. This is a testament to the intensity of the targeted nature of these attacks. The common denominator among these shooters is their profound anger and feelings of hopelessness fueled by their experience of psychological abuse at work.
For some of us, going to work has been like going into a leopard's cage, day in and out. And the advice that we often get focuses on the victims and how we should be more resilient, toughen up, figure out how to make them like you, and just get back into that cage. It is people of color, particularly women of color, who are affected the most. According to a study in Forbes, 1 in 3 professional women of color are ready to leave the workplace next year. The Oxford University Press suggests that Black women who face racial discrimination at work are nearly 3 times more likely to experience high levels of psychological despair compared to women who don't report that experience.
Anti-discrimination law is not enough to help targets of workplace abuse, and yet workplace abuse has a discriminatory impact on women and people of color. Because we're in a system of positive and negative stereotypes that translate into privileges and oppressions. So these stereotypes dictate who controls the narrative through closed-door conversations and subjective performance reviews versus who internalizes these narratives as trauma, wondering if they're the problem and feeling less than, fearful, and ashamed. They dictate who can speak up knowing they'll be given weight and respect without fear of retaliation or minimization, who can minimize others to maintain their power, who can easily find acceptance in the power groups because they look like them, versus who fears speaking up because they know they'll be gaslit or minimized, or who sees coworkers who look like them rendered invisible, easy to ignore, and outnumbered when they speak up. Those in power designed this system to maintain their power. It's not a fluke that CEO pay increased by almost 1,500% since 1978, nearly 400 times as much as a typical worker, while some multi-billion-dollar companies sign their workers up for social service benefits, not livable wages. They don't care if they psychologically abuse workers to the point of choosing between their health and a paycheck. They know they have way more resources to battle those who don't blindly obey. Nearly 60 years later, anti-discrimination law hasn't done its job of disrupting the status quo.
Or informal resolutions is first required. Then authorities attempt in-person intimidation because they can later invent something to counterbalance the target's recollection. Institutions also find any opportunity to minimize or dismiss written complaints, to claim ignorance and avoid reporting responsibilities. Multiple divisional processes and multiple authorities also help create plausible deniability. Similarly, retention policies quickly empty files by design and do not record who saw what when.
As a white cisgendered woman with tremendous privilege, I recognize that I am coming to you and speaking about my own abuse, but acknowledge and recognize the abuse that people with disabilities, women of color, people of color, and 2S LGBTQ individuals experience at work every day. People are looking for the economic case here to be made. As you're looking at a number of women of color who are being excluded from participating in the workforce and in the economy.
When I was 24 in 1998, I was working for Harvey Weinstein at Miramax Films. I was assaulted at the Venice Film Festival, and then afterwards forced to sign an egregious non-disclosure agreement along with my fellow assistant, Zelda Perkins. Our story has appeared in a book, in a movie, both entitled She Said. And we don't have a law that protects us and enables us to go forward and have a legal basis on which to make complaints against those who are much more powerful than us.
Louis Vuitton even suggested that I should apologize to the man who sexually harassed and assaulted me. At my insistence, they reluctantly hired an outside investigator, but she gaslit me, threatened my job, suggested I should be flattered by the harassment, and said I'd be called a troublemaker and a son of a bitch. Louis Vuitton excluded from the final report the internal restraining order she'd initially proposed. Before they even finished the investigation, Louis Vuitton publicly promoted the perp, which emboldened him to harass me more frequently. They lowered my evaluations, added negative comments, reduced my comp increases, excluded me from projects and events, and warned that they'd be, quote, keeping an eye on me. When I sought accountability under state law and company policy, Louis Vuitton threatened my attorneys. They jeopardized my career, livelihood, and life by publicly disclosing my home address and salary, seeking sanctions against me personally, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees from me. The CEO emailed all employees, basically calling me a liar, inciting them to ostracize and isolate me, misstating Louis Vuitton's knowledge and denying and mischaracterizing facts. Louis Vuitton repeated similar lies to the press and the court. After being hospitalized twice in 1 year, forced to take unpaid medical leave the following year, and diagnosed with PTSD, and having my case forced into arbitration, Louis Vuitton ramped up their relentless, psychologically abusive attacks to devastating levels, ultimately hiring a black general counsel to fire me in a manner intended to publicly humiliate, demean, and punish me, ending my livelihood and possibly my career, and trying to destroy me financially.
I have been worked as a workers' rights organizer at the Brazilian Women's Group for almost 10 years. Every week, workers have reached out asking for help based on the very toxic workplace environment. Workers have been called and verbally insulted by the employers daily. Vulnerable workers such as immigrants and undocumented workers are the most unprotected in terms of workplace violations such as wage theft, sexual harassment, discrimination, and psychological abuse. As an example, there are workers who have been called stupid, disabled, crazy, fat, and have been asked if they have dementia, neurological disability, or mental illness.
In toxic organizations, whistleblowers experience retribution, become targets, or are fired for fabricated errors or false claims of underperformance. Often the best employees they trigger bullies who fear being viewed in comparison as incompetent frauds. Bullying organizations are rife with turnover, vandalism, violence, absenteeism, poor productivity, and ill will. Bullies will often use the court system to file questionable lawsuits to harm their targets.
We should not have to suffer in silence. We should not have to die for our livelihood. We should not have to be hunted in the workplace. We should not have to endure employers not protecting our safety in the workplace. At one point in time in our U.S. history, there was a voice that stood up for spousal abuse, for child abuse, for domestic violence. I'm asking you to speak up with your voices against workplace bullying and harassment and protect our psychological safety.
Healthcare systems operating under a business model, fearful of litigations at every step, have resorted to creating a culture where the leaders design a system of silence, grant informal powers to everyone willing to show blind obedience, enabling a culture where cliques are formed and where hiding errors become easier. There's also a growing culture within the healthcare systems where sentinel events, including patient deaths, are being blamed on an individual caregiver to avoid systemic responsibility and lawsuits. Lack of psychological safety in healthcare cultivates a culture routinely generating poor patient care.
Then management was much more careful about how they bullied me. My manager put me in unsafe situations. She hovered over me, watching closely. She questioned my competence in front of patients. I dreaded every shift, I cried often, and I hardly slept. OSHA would take months to intervene, and I no longer had the mental battery or focus to advocate for myself, and I was giving up. I can't remember why I decided not to pull the medications and carry out my death plan, but after I did, I quit that job. Nurses have a high risk for suicide. We're smart enough to know how to die efficiently. We have access to all of the supplies. We know exactly what to say not to get Baker acted, and our mental health is assaulted nearly every shift. Hospitals have never treated us like heroes. They hardly treat us like humans. You will continue to hemorrhage healthcare workers unless you do something about this.
I have been accused of things I did not do, and I have been stalked and physically assaulted by a former coworker. As a result of the abuse, I have resigned myself to a diminished, impoverished quality of life. In 30 years, I have managed to scrape together an average annual income of only about $20,000 and accumulated about $300,000 in debt. If it had not been for my family, I would have died decades ago. I've lived for decades with symptoms of PTSD, major depressive disorder, anxiety, eating disorders, alcoholism, pill abuse, self-mutilation, sleep disturbances, digestive problems, and suicide attempts.
What happened to me at work should not have been legal, not anywhere, not in the United States, and certainly not at a nonprofit mental health organization. I saw the burnout and trauma we were sustaining was unsustainable. When Nina failed to act, my coworkers and I collectively petitioned management for a psychologically safe workplace. The targeted retaliation began immediately. When I told them I saw the bullying for what it was, Nita's full chain of command suddenly asserted that I was no longer a good fit. A baseless 2-week intensive probationary period began as a means to create just cause to fire me. This became an exercise in psychological abuse that dragged on for months, with constant supervision, humiliation, and bombardment with unending, negative, exaggerated, or patently false feedback. Nita's egregious union busting and the chatbot spectacular failure made global headlines. Yet most of my abusers remain in positions of power today due to silencing employees who dared question them previously with NDAs. I will end by saying psychological safety is a basic human right.
I became aware of the fact that there was a $20,000 salary disparity, so I began to speak up in hopes of amicably resolving the issue for 5 years. It didn't happen, so I filed a grievance with the Affirmative Action Office. As a result of filing the grievances, I was subjected to 200 acts of retaliation, which morphed into a hostile work environment. And ultimately, I was forced out of my job because I continued to speak up, but I continued to also be an exemplary employee. My husband died from opioid and alcohol abuse, well, opioid and alcohol as a result of secondary trauma. He left behind 4 offspring, and they're suffering to this day. They're also suffering because of what I went through for the 9 or so years at Northeastern University. Consulted 40 attorneys. I had to walk away from my case at the First Circuit Court of Appeals in 2014 because I was so traumatized I could not prepare the brief, nor could I pay the $20,000 for the attorneys. So.
Because there was jealousy and fear in the bully's eyes. Because of that, the bully attempted to do everything in her power to make my wife look bad. I wonder how you would feel if you watched your loved one go from being a vibrant, happy person who loved her job reduced to a puddle and a hot mess because of the bullying and mobbing. She was diagnosed with PTSD. This is damage to your brain you get in wars. She got it going to work and doing her job. With over 200 documented emails proving that this bullying was going on, she tried to do the right thing and go through the proper channels, but that only led to the institution to protect her themselves and do whatever they could to get rid of her.
The term workplace mobbing was coined by Heinz Lehmann, a psychiatrist in Sweden. It's a form of group bullying. It's eerily similar among anyone that experiences it. Unfortunately, it starts with a narcissistic bully who enlists unwitting participants to drive out someone in the workforce. It's, to me, not the problem of the bully, but the administration, and right now the American government, because a lot of other countries have already enlisted laws to prevent workplace mobbing and bullying. How is somebody that got a $10,000 a year raise like myself, 12 months later fired from their job? Had I continued working these last 12 years, I calculated I would have made about $200,000 tax money for income tax. Instead, this affected my heart, and it cost the government about $200,000, as I am now disabled from my illness and the repercussions of workplace mobbing.
And I was a C-suite executive who was very well respected until I took medical leave. My medical note was read by my boss to some of my colleagues. And upon my return, I was ousted from all executive meetings. People stopped speaking to me. I was micromanaged. My reporting structure was changed. And suddenly my stellar professional record was tainted. Nothing I did was good enough. I suddenly became useless and invisible to them. This abusive psychological journey took a toll on me. I went from being a successful and confident professional to someone completely broken.
I have been texted and made fun of for asking for help. I have been denied multiple requests to change shifts. I have been told my supervisor says she picked this shift, so she has to deal with it. My supervisor changed another tech to different hours and was told by someone in our department how wrong she was. She put her hand in that person's face and told them to stop. In April of this year, I was sexually assaulted by a soldier on the weekend while I was working by myself, and I was terrified to report due to my supervisor's abuse.
Workplace bullying starts with an organization that overlooks the way employees treat each other. Most workplace bullies probably have a diagnosable personality disorder with big egos and uncontrollable anger, but that's less relevant than the organizational structure that allows them to continue to abuse their power. I was a licensed psychologist and an attorney working for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for 15 years, and I could not get out from under the abuse of my particular bully. I've spent about $10,000 consulting with lawyers trying to find a tort that I can sue over or something else, but there was no option. I would get the response that said litigation was prohibitively expensive and they would turn down the cases. I finally left the job to save my physical and mental health, but I earn about a third of what I used to earn, and I'm never going to recover from the financial losses.
The bullying, mobbing, and insults began back in 2012 when I incurred a work-related injury in the workplace after repeatedly asking my physicians to intervene, as several management officials at the station constantly displayed abuse of power, lack of empathy and compassion, and enforcement of the EEOC established laws. I knew in my heart I was headed to the hospital and or the cemetery. The tactics used were atrocious and non-stop, not limited to harassment, bullying, mobbing, personal attacks, insults, persecution, false accusations, administrative and criminal witch hunts, and cyber-stalking hate crimes.
Hi, I want to show you a picture of me before. This is me after. They tell us to follow the chain of command, but they themselves violate their own policies and laws. They blocked my workplace harassment TPO. They went to a judge that worked for the county and they violated the law by telling the judge to block my workplace harassment TPO.
I was in the teaching field for my entire career, and I eventually last year just decided to leave the teaching field because of how prevalent this is. Just unreasonable expectations being placed on workers and being personally blamed and judged when you're inevitably not able to reach these high expectations. The principal was constantly berating me for anything, any tiny thing I did, like playing classical music in the classroom, anything that I did that she personally didn't like. There was also a lot of cliquey type behavior among coworkers that the principal, kind of encouraged, because it was like, if you were in her in circle, then you would be treated well and given good reviews.
So I have stand up for something which wasn't right. So since then I've been targeted and was written up for multiple times, and the retaliation was too much. I could not bear it, and it has a profound impact on my life. And now the family is separated and I could not able to see my kid.
Studies show that aside from physical illness associated with acute and chronic stress, Hollis in 2015 noted that the cost of these events for an individual could spend up to 3.9 hours per week bracing themselves for these exchanges if the bullying thrusts upon the target. This leads to decreased interaction, productivity of the target, and in their way to handle this, they engage in presentism, which means they come to work but they don't really work. Absenteeism both affect the overall cost of doing business. In my case, I was a manager of a small unit and disagreed with my supervisor about the discipline of one of my staff. I felt that he was being too extreme. My reward was to be transferred to another campus and demoted from manager to assistant nurse manager. I filed a complaint during this reassignment, which did not result in any action. Shortly thereafter, I was relegated to a communal computer room. Again, I filed another complaint. This limbo continued for 9 months. It should be noted that this assignment was far below my training and one that I viewed as punishment for doing the right thing and following policy. The investigation found that my treatment was inappropriate, but they did not return me to my position. The ongoing mental anguish profoundly impacted me, leading me to leave the profession of nursing after 50 years of service.